A millionaire's wife was kicked out of the house because of suspicion of adultery. Years later, the millionaire was shocked to receive a DNA test. The Stewart estate rose like a monument to wealth and dominance in the heart of New York. Its stately facade of cold grey stone, laced with creeping ivy, loomed over the manicured grounds. Inside, the air carried a constant hum of order. Maids shuffled silently through grand corridors, and the ticking of an antique grandfather clock echoed faintly, marking time in a house where tradition ruled. Richard Stewart stood near the bay window of the drawing room, his tailored suit impeccable, his stance rigid. Outside, Kathleen tended to Joe in the garden. The toddler's laughter cut through the estate's heaviness, a bright sound that seemed almost out of place against the formality of the mansion. Russell Stewart, patriarch of the family, leaned back in his leather armchair, eyes narrowing as he watched Richard glance toward the window once more. "She's been out there for over an hour," Russell said, his voice even, but with a sharp undertone. "Doesn't she have better things to do?" Richard turned, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "She's his mother. It's a garden, Dad, not a battlefield." Russell's lip twitched in a way that might have been a suppressed smirk or a sneer. "Mothers," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "are supposed to instill values, not let children run wild." Richard opened his mouth but stopped. He had learned long ago that with Russell, a defense could too easily turn into an argument. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, a telltale habit of restraint, and moved toward the door. "I'll be back late tonight," Richard said, picking up his briefcase. "Meetings with investors. I'll check in when I land in Los Angeles tomorrow." Russell raised his glass in a gesture of acknowledgement, but his eyes didn't follow Richard as he left. Instead, they lingered in the garden. Kathleen had scooped Joe into her arms, twirling him around. The boy's dark curls caught the late afternoon sunlight, but something in his features, soft, rounded, seemed foreign to Russell. "Stewart lineage," Russell muttered under his breath. "Strong jawlines, defined noses." Heather, who had been quietly arranging flowers at the far end of the room, turned her head slightly. "You're muttering again, Russell," she said without looking up. Her tone was light, but her hands trembled just enough to disrupt the symmetry of the bouquet. Russell stood, setting his drink down with a sharp clink. "There's a reason I mutter, Heather. I've discovered that using harsh language can irritate people's sensitive feelings." Heather looked up, her expression soft but wary. "Or maybe," she said gently, "your words are just unkind." Russell's sharp laugh filled the room. "Unkind? Heather, the boy doesn't look like Richard. Even you can't deny it." She didn't answer, her hands busier now, fussing over a flower that didn't need adjusting. "Suspicion," she said after a pause, "is a dangerous thing, Russell." "Suspicion is what keeps this family intact," he shot back. "We have a legacy to protect, a name. If I didn't question what needed questioning, who would?" Heather said nothing. Years of living under Russell's rule had taught her that silence was often the safest answer. But her fingers faltered again, and one of the roses snapped at the stem. Russell didn't notice. He was already pacing toward the study, his expression fixed in determination. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing the room in wood-paneled darkness. At his desk, he opened a drawer, retrieving the small plastic bag that contained a single strand of Joe's hair. Earlier that morning, while Kathleen had been distracted by Joe's insistence on chasing butterflies, Russell had plucked it from the boy's shoulder. It had been too easy, and that, in itself, made him uneasy. Things that came too easily were often riddled with hidden costs. He pulled out his phone and dialed the lab's number, his voice low and clipped as he confirmed the delivery of the sample. "Discretion," he emphasized, "is critical." Hanging up, Russell sat back and exhaled, slowly. His hand hovered over the decanter on his desk before pulling away. His sharp mind buzzed with possibilities, each more damning than the last. In the garden, Kathleen brushed a stray curl from Joe's forehead. His eyes, big, brown, and full of mischief, met hers, and he giggled as though he knew some secret she didn't. She held him close, her heart swelling with a love that was both grounding and fragile. Heather stepped out onto the terrace, her figure slight against the mansion's towering frame. "It's getting late," she called, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "Come inside before the chill sets in." Kathleen smiled at her mother-in-law and began walking back with Joe. But Heather's gaze flickered toward the study window where the faint glow of a desk lamp illuminated Russell's silhouette. Her hands tightened around the railing. "Suspicion," she murmured to herself, "has a way of destroying the very things it seeks to protect." Inside, Russell leaned forward at his desk, his fingers steepled, his eyes locked on the courier confirmation email on his screen. His lips curled into a thin line. The test results would come soon enough, and when they did, there would be no more shadows, no more doubts, just the cold, unshakable truth. The study was a fortress of mahogany and leather, its towering shelves lined with books that seemed to whisper old-world authority. The dim light from a brass desk lamp cast long shadows across Russell Stewart's face as he sat. The DNA report spread open before him. His jaw tightened with every word he reread, his finger tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished wood of the desk. The results were unambiguous, and they ignited something deep and primal within him. A need for control, for retribution. "Send her in," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence of the house. Minutes later, Kathleen appeared in the doorway, holding Joe in one arm, while her free hand clutched the edge of her cardigan. Her expression softened briefly when she spotted Heather lingering near the far wall. But Heather's downcast eyes offered no comfort. "You called for me?" Kathleen asked, her voice calm but with an undertone of unease. Russell gestured brusquely to a chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Kathleen obeyed, settling Joe on her lap. The toddler squirmed slightly, his dark curls catching the dim light, oblivious to the tension thickening the air. Kathleen adjusted his tiny shoes, her focus deliberately avoiding Russell's piercing gaze. Russell leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. "You've been in this family for years, Kathleen," he began, his voice deceptively measured, "and I've tolerated differences." Kathleen's head snapped up. "Differences?" He ignored her, his steely eyes fixed on her face. "But there's one thing I cannot overlook. One thing I will not forgive." He slid the report across the desk with a single, precise motion. "Explain this." She glanced down, her brow furrowing as she read the words. Her hand moved instinctively to Joe, pulling him closer as her mind scrambled to process what she was seeing. "Joe," her voice faltered. "This can't be right. There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake," Russell hissed, his composure cracking. He stood up from his chair, towering over her like a dark cloud. "I had that test done twice, and it says the same thing. This boy is not a Stewart." Kathleen's lips parted, her breath catching in disbelief. "You tested Joe's DNA without my knowledge?" Her voice rose slightly, but the tremor in it betrayed her growing panic. "Don't play the victim," Russell snapped, slamming a hand on the desk. "You've brought this upon yourself. Admit it, Kathleen. Admit what you've done." "I've done nothing," she shot back, standing now, her arms wrapped protectively around Joe. Her voice was fierce, but her eyes betrayed her desperation. "I have never betrayed Richard. I don't know how, why. These results say what they do, but I swear to you." "Swear all you like," Russell interrupted, his tone cutting. Your words mean nothing. You've dishonored this family. And now you'll leave." Kathleen blinked, as if the force of his words had physically struck her. "Leave," she repeated, her voice barely audible above a whisper. "You're throwing us out, without even giving Richard the chance to hear the truth." Russell's face hardened further. "Richard doesn't need to be burdened with this disgrace. I'll handle it. He'll thank me for it someday." Heather shifted uneasily in the corner, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Kathleen turned to her, pleading. "Heather, please. You know me. Say something. Please." Heather's gaze met Kathleen's for the briefest moment before dropping to the floor. Her silence was deafening. Russell moved to the study door and opened it, motioning to the butler standing in the hallway. "Get her things," he ordered. "She leaves tonight." Kathleen's knees felt weak, but she stood firm, holding Joe close. "You can't do this. Richard deserves to know." "Richard doesn't deserve a wife who lies," Russell shot back. "Consider this a mercy, Kathleen. Leave now and spare yourself more humiliation." She took a shaky step forward, then stopped. "This isn't mercy. This is cruelty," she said, her voice low and trembling. "And it won't stay hidden forever." Kathleen stood in the dimly lit bedroom, her hands trembling as she folded Joe's tiny clothes into a battered suitcase. The room now felt suffocating, with the walls closing in with each beat of her frantic heart. Joe sat quietly on the bed, his wide eyes following her every move, as though sensing the gravity of the moment, but not understanding it. She glanced at the phone on the nightstand. A lifeline. A connection. She hesitated only briefly before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as she dialed Richard's number. The first ring hadn't even finished when the door swung open. Russell's imposing figure filled the doorway, his face a mask of cold authority. "What do you think you're doing?" he said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through her panic. Kathleen froze, the receiver slipping from her hand. I need to speak to Richard. He deserves to know the truth," she stammered, her voice trembling, but resolute. Russell strode forward, his presence overwhelming the small room. "The truth?" he scoffed, grabbing the phone before she could reach for it again. "The truth is, you've already lost the right to speak to him." "You can't stop me," Kathleen cried, her voice breaking. "Richard will understand. He'll come for us." "If he loves you, Kathleen," Russell interrupted, his tone icy, "he'll come for you, on his own. He doesn't need your cries for help. And if he doesn't?" He leaned closer, his voice a quiet, venomous whisper. "Then you've proven me right." Kathleen's breath caught, her resolve wavering under the weight of his words. He stepped back, phone in hand, and gestured toward the suitcase. "Finish packing. The car will be ready soon." As he left, the door clicked shut with an air of finality, sealing Kathleen in her despair. The rain began as she crossed the threshold of the estate, cold drops seeping into her cardigan. Joe nestled his head against her shoulder, murmuring sleepily, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in his mother's heart. Kathleen paused at the gate, glancing back at the mansion one last time. Its towering silhouette loomed against the night sky, a monument to everything she had lost in the span of a single evening. The rain intensified as Kathleen turned away, the heavy iron gate clanging shut behind her. She pulled Joe closer, her resolve hardening with every step into the darkness. The small apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and creaking floors, was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Stewart estate. Kathleen stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing plates that weren't really dirty. The rhythmic motion was a distraction, a fragile attempt to suppress the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. "Mummy?" Joe's soft voice broke through her haze. Kathleen turned, forcing a smile as she crouched down to meet her son's eyes. "Yes, sweetheart?" Joe clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted from years of love. "When's Daddy coming home?" The question struck her with force. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the dishcloth. "Daddy's very busy right now, Joe," she said softly, brushing a curl from his forehead. "But he loves you very much." Joe nodded, seemingly satisfied, and wandered back to the corner of the room where his toy cars were neatly lined up. Kathleen exhaled, the weight in her chest growing heavier. The lie felt like a betrayal. But what choice did she have? How could she explain that Richard didn't even know where they were? The truth was, Kathleen hadn't stopped thinking about him. Every time her phone buzzed with a notification, hope flickered momentarily before fading into the cold reality that it was never him. Russell's warning echoed in her mind. If he loves you, he'll come for you on his own. Across the country in Los Angeles, Richard sat in the back of a sleek black town car, his phone in one hand and a portfolio of documents in the other. The glow of the city lights flickered past the windows, but his mind was elsewhere. "You're distracted tonight," his assistant Mark remarked from the seat beside him. "Something on your mind?" Richard glanced at him, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thumbed through the messages on his phone. None were from Kathleen. He found the silence disconcerting, yet he couldn't pinpoint the reason. "I just haven't heard from Kathleen in a while," he admitted finally. "It's unusual." Mark shrugged, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Family life. Sometimes no news is good news, right?" Richard nodded absently, but his gut told him otherwise. Kathleen always called before bedtime, her voice a calming presence after the chaos of the day. Her silence now was unnerving. When he returned to his hotel room later that night, Richard dialed home. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Frowning, he tried Kathleen's cell, but the line went straight to voicemail. He considered calling Russell, but something held him back, a nagging suspicion he couldn't quite shake. Back in New York, Russell was sitting in his study, the DNA report tucked away in a drawer. His expression was unreadable as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Heather lingered in the doorway, her posture tense. "She didn't deserve that," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. Russell didn't look at her. "Deserve what? Facing the truth?" His tone was dismissive, cold. Heather stepped forward, wringing her hands. "And Richard, does he deserve to be lied to?" At that, Russell turned sharply, his gaze piercing. "I'm protecting him. Protecting this family." Heather shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "From what, Russell?" "The truth." He didn't answer, turning his back to her as if the conversation were over. When Richard finally returned to New York, the house felt empty, eerily so. Kathleen's absence was palpable. The warmth she brought to the estate was extinguished. He searched the house for her, his steps growing more frantic with each passing moment. "Where's Kathleen?" he demanded, when he found Russell in the dining room, casually leafing through the newspaper. Russell folded the paper neatly, placing it on the table before meeting Richard's gaze. "She's gone." "Gone?" Richard's voice rose, his fists clenching at his sides. "What do you mean, gone? Where did she go?" "She admitted everything," Russell said calmly, though his eyes gleamed with something darker. "She left. It's better this way." Richard stared at his father, his mind racing. "Admitted what? What are you talking about?" Russell leaned back in his chair, his expression impassive. That Joe isn't your son. She knew the disgrace she'd brought to this family and left before causing further damage. The words struck Richard sharply, yet his instincts ignited. Something about Russell's tone, his calm certainty, felt wrong. Kathleen wouldn't have left without speaking to him. She wouldn't have left Joe behind. "You're lying," Richard said finally, his voice low but firm. "I know Kathleen. She wouldn't do this." Russell's expression flickered briefly, discomfort perhaps, but he recovered quickly. "Believe what you want, Richard, but she's gone, and it's time to move on." Richard left the room without another word, his mind churning. His father's explanation didn't sit right with him, and the growing unease gnawed at his resolve. Kathleen's disappearance wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something he had to uncover. Richard stood in the doorway of the nursery, staring at the empty crib. His jaw tightened as he made a silent vow. Whatever had happened, he would find Kathleen and Joe, and he would find out the truth. It had been 5 years since Kathleen had walked out of the Stewart estate under the weight of Russell's accusations and her own unanswered questions. 5 years since she had last heard Richard's voice, since Joe's laughter had echoed through the grand halls of the mansion. The years had whizzed by, each day a struggle for survival. Now, the city seemed to hum with life around her as she moved through the cramped diner where she worked. The clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversations filled the air, punctuated by the occasional bark of an order from the kitchen. Kathleen balanced a tray of steaming plates, her movements efficient and practiced. "Table 6, Kathleen," barked her manager, a stout man with a permanent scowl. "I've got it," she replied, weaving through the crowded tables. Her smile was automatic as she set down plates in front of a pair of patrons. Her heart stopped only when she turned back toward the counter. He was there. Richard. Sitting in a booth near the window, his back straight and his hands folded on the table, he looked older, his face sharper, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. But there was no mistaking him. The tailored suit, the piercing blue eyes scanning the room. It was Richard Stewart, unmistakably out of place in the diner's modest chaos. Kathleen froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray as a wave of emotions crashed over her. Shock, fear, and a flicker of something she couldn't name. She considered retreating to the kitchen, slipping out the back door, but her legs refused to move. Then Joe's voice broke the moment. "Mum, look!" Kathleen turned just as Joe bounded up to her, clutching a paper airplane he'd folded from a menu. At 5, he was all energy, his dark curls bouncing as he ran. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with pride. But those eyes, Richard's eyes, were what caught her breath again. "Joe," she said softly, crouching to his level and brushing a curl from his forehead. "Why don't you play at the counter for a bit, okay?" Joe's lips puckered in protest, but he nodded, running off to the counter where the hostess gave him an indulgent smile. Kathleen straightened, her pulse quickening as she realized Richard was watching them both, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to still. She saw recognition flash in his face, followed by something more, shock, disbelief, and then unmistakable determination. Kathleen forced her feet to move, her tray clutched tightly in her hands. She turned toward the kitchen, hoping to escape his gaze, but it was too late. "Kathleen," his voice called, low but firm, cutting through the noise. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Kathleen, wait." Slowly she turned, her mask of composure firmly in place. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but distant. Richard stood, his height making him an imposing figure, even in the unassuming diner. He took a step toward her, his eyes flicking briefly to Joe, before settling back on her face. "It's been a long time," he said, his tone cautious, as if he was assessing the situation. Kathleen tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It has," she said evenly, though her hands gripped the tray tightly enough that her knuckles whitened. "I think we need to talk," Richard continued, his gaze unwavering. "Privately." Her instinct was to say no, to walk away and never look back. But something in his voice, something she hadn't heard in years, gave her pause. There was no accusation, no anger, just a quiet resolve that unnerved her more than anything else. "I can't right now," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm working." "After your shift," he said, his tone softening, but his eyes firm. "Please." Kathleen hesitated, her composure cracking just slightly as her gaze flicked to Joe, now happily chatting with the hostess. She looked back at Richard, her eyes narrowing. "Fine," she said at last, her tone guarded. "But just for a few minutes." Richard nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying an undercurrent of relief. Kathleen turned away, her heart pounding as she retreated to the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she set the tray down, her thoughts racing. 5 years of distance, of silence, and now he was here, asking questions she wasn't sure she could answer. As Kathleen returned to the floor, her composure carefully restored, her eyes drifted to Joe, who was now folding another paper airplane. Richard watched him, his expression unreadable but intense. Kathleen's chest tightened. She had agreed to the conversation, but she wasn't sure she was ready for the truths it might uncover. The park was hushed under the dim glow of the streetlights, their faint hum blending with the distant sounds of the city. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the fallen leaves across the cobblestones. Kathleen sat stiffly on a weathered bench, her hands clasped in her lap, the tension in her shoulders betraying the calm she was trying to project. Richard stood a few feet away, his figure silhouetted against the soft glow of a nearby lamppost. He hesitated before sitting down beside her, the space between them filled with unspoken words. For a moment, neither spoke, the quiet weight of the years they'd lost settling between them. "I looked for you," Richard said finally, his voice low, steady. "For 5 years, Kathleen. I never stopped looking." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Did you?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to draw blood. "Yes," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Every lead, every whisper. I followed them all. But it was like you disappeared. Like you didn't want to be found?" Kathleen exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. "I didn't disappear, Richard. I was forced to leave." Richard frowned, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about? Forced?" She turned away, her eyes fixed on a patch of gravel, as if it held the answers she was trying to gather. "Your father," she began, her voice steady, despite the pain that laced every word. "He accused me of infidelity. He had Joe's DNA tested, without my knowledge, without my consent. The results said Joe wasn't his grandson. He used that to justify throwing us out." Richard's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "That's not possible," Richard uttered, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "Joe is my son." Kathleen's laugh was short, bitter. "Do you think I didn't try to tell him that? Do you think I didn't beg him to let me explain? But Russell wasn't interested in explanations. He told me I was a disgrace, that I had dishonored your family." Richard shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "And he told me you left," he murmured. "That you admitted everything and left with another man." Kathleen turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Do you believe him?" "No." The word was immediate, absolute. "I never believed it. That's why I kept looking. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know it was this." His voice broke, the anger and sorrow clear in his tone. "Kathleen, I'm so sorry." She looked away, blinking back the sting of tears. "Your apology doesn't change what happened. For 5 years, I raised Joe on my own. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story. I was there. And you—" Her voice faltered, but she steadied herself. "You weren't." "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. "If I had—" "But you didn't," she cut in, her tone sharper now. "You trusted your father instead of me." Richard looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Let me fix this," he said, leaning closer. "Let me prove to you that Joe is my son." "How?" she asked, her voice brittle. Russell already had his proof. "I'll take the test myself," he said firmly. "Not Russell's test. Mine. We'll do it properly this time, together. And when the results come back, I'll show them to him, to everyone, and I'll make sure he knows the truth." Kathleen stared at him, her resolve wavering under the weight of his sincerity. "And then what, Richard? What happens after that?" "Then we rebuild," he said simply. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll make it right. I'll bring you and Joe home, where you belong." A soft voice interrupted them. "Mummy." They both turned to see Joe standing a few feet away, clutching the paper airplane he had folded earlier. His eyes darted between them, curious and innocent. "Are you coming back to the diner? It's getting cold." Kathleen smiled faintly and beckoned him over. As Joe climbed onto her lap, Richard's eyes softened. The resemblance was undeniable. The curls, the shape of his face, the eyes. There was no doubt in his mind now. "Joe," Richard said gently, his voice warm, "do you remember me?" Joe tilted his head, studying Richard for a moment before nodding. "You're the man from the diner," he said matter-of-factly. Richard chuckled softly. "That's right. I'm also someone who cares a lot about you and your mum." Joe looked up at Kathleen, his brow furrowing slightly. "Is he going to stay?" Kathleen didn't answer right away. Her gaze locked with Richard's. She saw the determination in his eyes, the promise. Finally, she exhaled and turned to Joe. "Maybe," she said softly. "We'll see." Cliffhanger. As Richard rose to leave, he turned back to Kathleen, his expression resolute. "I'll arrange the test tomorrow," he said, "and after that, we'll start fixing what's broken." Kathleen nodded faintly, but doubt lingered in her eyes. Trust, once shattered, would take more than words to rebuild. Do you think Richard is at fault in this story? If so, leave a comment saying lemon, and if you feel sorry for him, write lime. The sterile walls of the DNA testing lab were as clinical as they were uninviting. Richard sat in a stiff chair, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the armrest. Across from him, Kathleen held Joe on her lap, her body tense. The boy, oblivious to the weight of the moment, fiddled with a toy car, its tiny wheels spinning in the silence. "You're sure this will settle it?" Kathleen asked, breaking the quiet. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her wariness. "It will," Richard replied firmly. He glanced at Joe, a pang of guilt tightening in his chest. This time, there's no one to manipulate the truth. The nurse entered, carrying a clipboard. "We'll need samples from both Mr. Stewart and young Joe," she said, with practiced politeness. Kathleen nodded, gently guiding Joe as Richard followed the nurse into the adjoining room. The process was quick, simple swabs and signatures, but the tension lingered long after. Back in the waiting area, Kathleen watched Joe line up his toy cars on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You look tired," Richard said quietly, sitting down beside her. His gaze softened. "Have you been taking care of yourself?" She gave a humorless laugh. 5 years as a single mother doesn't leave much time for that. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly. I'm sorry, Kathleen. For everything. I trusted the wrong person, and you paid the price. Kathleen didn't look at him. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on Joe, who was now murmuring to his cars. We'll see if your apology holds up, she said finally, her tone clipped. Once we have the results. 2 days later, Richard sat alone in his apartment, the envelope from the lab resting on the coffee table like a silent challenge. The soft hum of city noise seeped through the windows, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. He opened the envelope with deliberate care, unfolding the paper inside. His eyes scanned the results, and a wave of relief crashed over him. Biological match, the word stood out in bold. Joe was his son. Kathleen was right. She had been right all along. Kathleen sat across from him at his apartment's modest dining table, her expression unreadable as he handed her the document. She read it slowly, her fingers tightening on the paper. When she finally looked up, her eyes glistened, but her face was calm. I didn't need this, she said softly, placing the paper on the table. I've always known the truth. Richard leaned forward, his voice breaking slightly. But I needed it. Not because I doubted you, Kathleen, but because I doubted myself. I should have fought harder. I should have trusted you. She said nothing, her silence louder than any response. Joe played quietly in the corner, his presence a reminder of what had been stolen from them. I want to fix this, Richard continued. I want to take you and Joe back to the estate, to face my father, to clear your name. Kathleen looked at him sharply. And what happens when he denies it, when he refuses to accept the truth? He won't have a choice, Richard said firmly. The evidence is here. He can't manipulate it or ignore it anymore. She studied him, searching for cracks in his resolve. Finally, she nodded. If we do this, it's for Joe, she said. Not for me, not for you. For Joe, Richard agreed, his voice filled with conviction. As the car pulled up to the Stewart estate later that evening, the tension in the air was palpable. The once familiar sight of the mansion loomed ahead, its grand facade bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Kathleen stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Joe dozed against her shoulder. Richard glanced at her. Are you ready? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the mansion, memories of her last night there flashing through her mind. Finally, she exhaled and turned to him. Let's get this over with. Richard stepped out first, opening the door for Kathleen. She adjusted Joe in her arms, her movements precise and careful. The three of them stood together at the entrance, their shared determination a silent shield against the confrontation to come. As Richard raised his hand to knock, the heavy oak doors creaked open. A butler stood on the threshold, his expression neutral, but his eyes flickering with curiosity. Mr. Stewart, he said, stepping aside. Richard's jaw tightened as he led Kathleen and Joe into the house. This time, he wasn't leaving without answers. The dining room was a monument to the Stewart family's legacy. A massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a cold, golden glow over the polished mahogany table that stretched nearly the length of the room. The faint clink of ice against glass broke the silence as Russell swirled his drink, his sharp eyes narrowing when Richard entered, Kathleen close behind, with Joe resting against her shoulder. Russell set his glass down deliberately, his gaze locking onto Kathleen. I see. You've brought our guest back, he said coolly. Unexpected, but then again, you've always had a flair for dramatics, Richard. Richard's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his pocket and slapping it onto the table. This isn't a social visit, Dad. We're here to clarify the situation. Russell raised an eyebrow, but didn't move. And what record would that be? The one you destroyed 5 years ago, Richard snapped. The one where you accused Kathleen of infidelity and forced her out of this house. Russell's expression hardened, though his posture remained relaxed. I acted in this family's best interest. Protecting the Stewart name is a duty you seem to have forgotten. Protecting the Stewart name, Richard shot back. By lying, by tearing apart my family. He leaned closer, his voice low but fierce. Joe is my son, and here's the proof. Russell's gaze flickered to the document on the table, but didn't move to pick it up. Another test, he said dismissively. Convenient, don't you think? Perhaps Kathleen's influence is more persistent than I thought. Kathleen, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. You tested Joe behind my back, humiliated me, and threw me out of this house without a second thought, she said. You called me a disgrace. You told me I wasn't worthy of your family. Do you even realize what you did to us? Russell's face darkened, but he didn't respond. You didn't just take away our home, she continued, her voice trembling now. You took away Joe's father. You stole 5 years of his life with lies. Heather, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the glass of water in front of her. Russell leaned back in his chair, his expression as cold as ever. I did what I had to do. If you were innocent, Kathleen, why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you prove me wrong then? Kathleen's eyes flared with anger. Because you didn't give me a chance. You blocked my calls, cut me off from Richard, and made it clear that my voice didn't matter in this house. Joe stirred on Kathleen's shoulder, his small hand clutching her blouse. She adjusted him gently, her movements deliberate, as though grounding herself in his presence. I believed you, Richard said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of regret. For a while I believed you. But then I started to question everything. If it weren't for that doubt, I might never have found them. And now I know the truth. He gestured to the paper on the table. That's the truth. Joe is my son. You lied to me, Dad. Russell finally stood, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the room. His gaze shifted from Richard to Kathleen, and then to Joe. For a brief moment, his expression flickered. Anger, disbelief, something unspoken. But it was gone, as quickly as it came. You've made your point, he said coldly, but don't expect me to apologize for protecting this family. Protecting? Heather's voice broke the tension, soft but trembling with suppressed emotion. All eyes turned to her as she slowly rose from her chair. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. Heather, Russell began, but she cut him off. No, Russell, she said, her voice gaining strength. You don't get to talk about protecting this family, not when you've spent years hiding the truth. What are you talking about? Richard asked, his brow furrowing. Heather's gaze met her son's and her eyes filled with tears. I've kept quiet for too long, she said, her voice cracking, but I can't do it anymore. There's something you all need to know. Russell's face paled, his stern composure cracking for the first time. Heather, he said sharply, his voice laced with warning. Don't. But Heather's trembling hands rested on the back of the chair, her expression resolute. She turned back to Richard, her voice firm despite her tears. Richard, she said, there's something about your father you don't know. Heather took a deep breath, her voice steady now as she prepared to deliver the truth that would shatter the foundation of the Stewart family. Russell isn't your biological father. The air in the dining room grew impossibly still every sound muffled as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Heather's words lingered in the air, each syllable weighted with a kind of truth that could never be taken back. "What did you just say?" Richard asked, his voice low, the edge of disbelief slicing through his words. Heather's hands trembled as she gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "Russell isn't your biological father," she repeated, her voice firmer now, though her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Russell took a sharp step forward, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Heather, stop this!" he barked. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying, Russell," Heather shot back, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've carried this secret for too long, letting it fester, letting it destroy us. But I won't stay silent anymore." Richard's breath came shallow and fast as he stared at his mother. "What are you talking about? How could he?" His voice cracked, the weight of her revelation pressing down on him. Heather turned to Richard, her expression pleading. "You have to understand, Richard. I was young and lonely and Russell was so consumed with his work. I made a mistake, one I've regretted every day since." Kathleen, standing beside Richard, felt her own stomach twist at the raw vulnerability in Heather's confession. She tightened her hold on Joe, who watched the unfolding drama with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Russell's composure shattered completely. "You're lying," he shouted, his voice breaking in a way that seemed almost unnatural for a man who prided himself on control. "You're trying to tear this family apart." Heather's gaze hardened as she faced her husband. "This family was torn apart the moment you let your pride and hatred take over, the moment you drove Kathleen and Joe away." Richard stepped between them, his voice rising. "So, this is what it's all been about?" He turned to Russell, his expression a mixture of anger and anguish. "You suspected all along, didn't you, that I wasn't yours? That's why you've spent your life controlling everything, because you thought I wasn't worthy of the Stewart name." Russell opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, his face turned a shade of ashen grey, his hand flying to his chest as he stumbled back. "Russell!" Heather cried, rushing to his side. He collapsed into the chair behind him, his breathing ragged and shallow. His hand clutched at his chest as beads of sweat broke out across his forehead. Call an ambulance," he gasped. Richard froze for only a second before pulling out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. "We need an ambulance at the Stewart estate," he said, his voice shaking. "My father. He's having a heart attack." The room erupted into chaos. Heather hovered over Russell, her hands fluttering uselessly as she whispered, "Stay with me, Russell. Please." Kathleen guided Joe toward the far corner, shielding him from the scene, murmuring quiet reassurances. Richard knelt beside his father, his anger momentarily replaced by fear. "Hold on, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "Help is coming." The sound of sirens filled the air moments later, growing louder as the ambulance approached. Paramedics burst into the room, their movements efficient as they worked to stabilize Russell. Heather clung to Richard's arm as they loaded Russell onto the stretcher, her tears falling freely now. As the paramedics wheeled Russell out, Heather turned to Richard, her face etched with guilt and sorrow. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for everything, for the lies, the silence, for the pain I've caused you." Richard didn't respond immediately. His gaze followed the stretcher as it disappeared into the ambulance, the enormity of the night's revelations weighing heavily on him. Finally, he turned to Kathleen, who stood a few feet away. Joe nestled protectively in her arms. Their eyes met, a mixture of shock, grief, and an unspoken question hanging between them. The ambulance pulled away, its siren fading into the distance. Richard stepped closer to Kathleen, his voice barely audible over a whisper. "What do we do now?" Kathleen's eyes flickered toward Heather, who stood silently, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "We find out what comes next," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing around them. The hospital waiting room was steeped in an oppressive quiet, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Heather sat hunched in a corner, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale and drawn. Across from her, Richard leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the tiled floor. Kathleen sat beside him, Jo nestled against her, asleep in the safety of her arms. The sterile fluorescent light bathed the room in an unforgiving glare, exposing every line of exhaustion etched across their faces. Time seemed to drag, each passing second a cruel reminder of the uncertainty that hung over them. Heather's trembling voice finally broke the silence. "I don't know where to begin." Richard didn't look up, his jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. "The beginning would be a good place," he said, his tone clipped, but not unkind. Heather swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with tears. "I've spent years living with this guilt," she began. "I told myself I was doing what was best for this family, that staying silent was the right thing to do. But I was wrong, and in my silence, I let Russell's cruelty fester. I let him destroy everything that mattered." Kathleen's gaze softened as she looked at Heather. "Why didn't you speak up?" she asked gently, though her voice carried the weight of years of pain. "Why let him do what he did to me, to Jo?" Heather let out a shaky breath, her fingers twisting together. "Fear," she confessed, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "Fear of losing everything. Fear of what the truth would do to this family. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could protect Richard. But all I did was hurt him. And you." Richard finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting his mother's. They were filled with anger, but also something deeper, an ache that couldn't be put into words. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out your entire life was built on a lie?" he asked, his voice cracking. Heather nodded, her tears spilling over. "I do," she said, her voice trembling. "Every day, I lived with that knowledge, and every day, I hated myself a little more for not telling you." Kathleen shifted Jo slightly, her hand smoothing his curls. "And Russell?" she asked. "Did he know?" Heather hesitated, her hands tightening in her lap. "I told him shortly after you were born, Richard. I thought he deserved to know. He never forgave me. But he swore he would raise you as his own, for the sake of the Stewart name." Richard's laugh was bitter, hollow. "And that's why he spent my entire life trying to control me. Why he tore apart my family the moment he had an excuse." Heather flinched at the harshness in his voice. "I failed you," she whispered. "In every way that matters, I failed you." Richard stood abruptly, pacing the small waiting room. "I don't know what to do with this, Mom," he said, his voice raw. "I don't know how to process any of it." Kathleen reached out, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm as he passed. "She's trying," she said softly. "It doesn't undo the past, but it's a start." He stopped, his gaze dropping to Kathleen's. Her calm steadied him, and after a moment he nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned back to Heather, his expression conflicted. "I need time," he said finally. "But I forgive you for telling the truth now, even if it's too late for so much else." Heather choked back a sob, her hands covering her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve it. But thank you." Kathleen's voice broke the silence that followed. "We all made mistakes," she said, her tone firm but kind. "But what matters now is Joe. We owe it to him, to rebuild what we can." Heather looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "You're right," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The door to the waiting room creaked open, and a doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Stewart?" he asked, his gaze landing on Heather. She shot to her feet, her hands trembling. "Yes?" The doctor's expression was calm, but serious. "Your husband is stable. He had a significant cardiac event, but we were able to intervene in time. He's awake now, but he's very weak." Heather exhaled a tremulous breath of relief, her hands instinctively reaching for her chest. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "We'll allow brief visits, but he needs to rest." Heather turned to Richard, her expression pleading. "Will you come with me?" Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening. Kathleen rose, placing a steadying hand on his back. "Go," she urged softly. "You'll regret it if you don't." Richard glanced at her, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." As Heather and Richard walked toward Russell's room, Kathleen sat back down, holding Joe close. Her gaze was calm, but resolute. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it together. The hospital room was bathed in sterile light, its quiet punctuated by the soft beeping of monitors. Russell lay propped up in the hospital bed, his face pale and drawn, the fierce composure he once carried now replaced by vulnerability. His eyes flickered open as Heather and Richard stepped inside, their hesitant footsteps breaking the stillness. Heather's hands trembled as she approached the bedside, her gaze fixed on her husband's ashen face. "Russell," she began softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Russell turned his head slowly, his sharp eyes dulled by exhaustion. For a moment, he said nothing, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Then he exhaled heavily, his voice rasping. "What are you sorry for, Heather? For the lies? Or for finally telling the truth?" Heather flinched, but didn't retreat. She knelt beside the bed, her hands clutching the edge of the mattress. "For everything," she said, her voice trembling, "for the years of silence, for the pain I caused you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know how deeply I regret what I did." Russell's gaze softened slightly, though his features remained guarded. "I spent years holding on to that anger," he murmured, his voice faint but steady. "It consumed me. I thought if I controlled everything I could make it right. But all I did was push everyone away." Richard, standing at the foot of the bed, crossed his arms. "You didn't just push us away," he said, his tone sharp. "You destroyed lives. You threw Kathleen and Joe out without a second thought. Do you even realize what you did to them?" Russell's eyes shifted to Richard, the weight of his son's words settling over him like a shroud. "I do," he said finally, his voice low. "And it's something I'll carry for the rest of my life." Heather wiped at her eyes, her voice firm, despite her tears. "You need to make it right, Russell. With Kathleen, with Joe, with Richard." Russell nodded slowly, his frailty making the movement seem monumental. "Bring them in," he said hoarsely. "I need to see them." Minutes later, Kathleen entered, her steps tentative. Joe clung to her hand, his wide eyes darting around the room. Richard followed close behind, his expression a mixture of caution and resolve. Russell's gaze softened as it landed on Joe. The boy's resemblance to Richard was undeniable, and for the first time, Russell allowed himself to truly see it. "Joe," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Come here." Joe glanced up at Kathleen, who gave him a reassuring nod. He let go of her hand and approached the bed cautiously, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing machinery surrounding it. Russell extended a trembling hand, his fingers brushing Joe's curls. "I've been a fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I let my pride blind me. I see now what I've missed, and I'll never forgive myself for it." Joe tilted his head, his innocent gaze searching Russell's face. "Are you sick?" he asked softly. Russell smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Yes, I am. But seeing you, it helps." Joe reached out, his small hand resting on Russell's. "Mum says you're supposed to say sorry when you hurt someone." Russell's breath caught, and tears welled in his eyes. He turned his gaze to Kathleen, who stood a few steps away, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Kathleen," he said, his voice trembling, "I was wrong. I was cruel, and I can never undo the harm I caused. But I am deeply, truly sorry." Kathleen hesitated, her emotions warring behind her calm facade. Finally, she nodded, her voice steady. "It's not me you need to make it up to," she said. "It's Joe." Russell looked back at the boy, his throat tightening. "Joe," he said, his voice cracking, "I've been a terrible grandfather, but if you'll let me, I'd like to change that." Joe studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said simply, his hand tightening around Russell's. Richard stepped closer, his gaze locking with his father's. "And me?" he asked quietly. "What about us?" Russell's eyes closed briefly, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. When he opened them, they were filled with sincerity. "You'll always be my son," he said firmly. "Blood doesn't change that. I've been hard on you, Richard, too hard. I see that now. And I'm sorry." Heather placed a hand on Russell's arm, her expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "We've both made mistakes," she said, "but it's not too late to try to fix them." Russell nodded, his gaze sweeping over his family. "No," he said softly, "it's not too late." As the room settled into a fragile peace, Russell turned to Richard and Kathleen. "You belong here," he said. "This house, this family, it's yours as much as it's mine. Come back. Let's start again." Richard looked at Kathleen, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange. After a long moment, she nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "We'll come back," Richard said, his voice resolute. "But only if things change." "They will," Russell promised. "They have to." As the family departed from the hospital room, the burden of the past started to diminish. Outside, the night air was cool and brimming with the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in years, they walked together, toward a future that felt just within reach. The morning sun bathed Central Park in a golden glow, the kind of light that softened edges and made everything feel a little more hopeful. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the laughter of children and the faint music of a street performer nearby. The Stewart family, gathered on a sprawling green lawn, seemed to fit seamlessly into the scene. Joe's laughter rang out as he darted across the grass, his kite trailing behind him, its bright colors slicing through the clear blue sky. Russell stood a few steps behind, his usually stern expression softened as he guided Joe's movements, his voice steady and encouraging. "Keep running, Joe. Higher," he called, his hand briefly on the string before letting the boy take full control. Heather watched from a nearby bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a peaceful smile playing on her lips. Kathleen sat beside her, her posture relaxed for the first time in years. The animosity that once stood between them had melted, replaced by a quiet understanding born of shared regrets and a mutual desire to move forward. "You know," Kathleen said softly, her gaze following Joe as he spun in circles, "I didn't think we'd ever get to this point." Heather turned to her, her expression earnest. "Neither did I," she admitted, "but I'm glad we're here. I'm glad we've been given the chance to start over." Kathleen nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "For Joe's sake, it's worth it." A few feet away, Richard leaned against a tree, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. His father's uncharacteristic laughter mingled with Joe's, the sound both surreal and comforting. He couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude for this moment, for the chance to rebuild what had been so thoroughly broken. Kathleen joined him, her arm brushing lightly against his. "You're quiet," she observed. Richard glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Just thinking," he said, "about how much has changed, about how close we came to losing all of this." Kathleen tilted her head, studying him. And I'm grateful," he said simply. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Grateful for you, for Joe, for the second chance we've been given." Her smile widened, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. "It's not going to be easy," she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. "No," Richard agreed. "But we'll figure it out. Together." A burst of laughter drew their attention back to Joe, who was now tugging on Russell's hand, urging him to run with the kite. To everyone's surprise, Russell obliged, his movements slow but deliberate, his face alight with an energy that seemed to erase years from his features. Heather chuckled, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said. Kathleen's eyes softened. "It's good for him," she said quietly. "For all of us." As the afternoon stretched on, the family settled onto a picnic blanket beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Joe leaned against Russell, his tiny hand clutching the older man's sleeve as he recounted an elaborate tale about his kite-flying adventures. Russell listened intently, nodding at the right moments, his stern demeanor replaced by a grandfatherly warmth. Heather passed sandwiches to Kathleen, her gaze lingering on Richard, who was tossing a frisbee to a group of children nearby. "You raised a good man," she said softly. Kathleen glanced at her, surprised. "I think he raised himself," she replied. "But thank you." Heather hesitated, her expression growing serious. "I hope you know how deeply I regret everything," she said. "Not just the lies, but the way I let things spiral. I should have done more to stop Russell, to protect you and Joe." Kathleen reached over, placing a hand on Heather's. "We've all made mistakes," she said gently. "What matters is that we're here now, moving forward." Heather's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of amber and gold, the Stewarts began to pack up their belongings. Joe, exhausted but happy, clung to Richard as he carried him toward the car. Russell walked beside them, his steps slow but steady, his hand resting on Joe's back. Kathleen and Heather followed closely, their conversation light but meaningful. There was an ease between them now, a fragile but growing bond that promised better days ahead. When they reached the car, Russell turned to Richard, his gaze steady. "You've built something remarkable, Richard," he said, "a family worth fighting for." Richard met his father's eyes, the weight of their shared history lingering for a moment before dissipating. "I learned from the best," he said, his tone carrying a hint of warmth. Russell's lips twitched into a small smile. "Let's keep learning," he said. The family walked away from the park, their steps in sync, their laughter mingling with the fading sounds of the city. The shadows of their past no longer loomed as heavily, replaced by the promise of a brighter, united future.